The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the weathered general store, and Marianne Walsh stepped down into the dusty street of Concord, Colorado, carrying everything she owned in a single canvas bag and wearing a dress that had once been blue, but now matched the color of the endless prairie she'd crossed to get here. Adam Northfield saw her from where he stood outside the feed store, his hands stilling on the rope he'd been coiling, and something in his chest that had been locked tight for 3 years suddenly cracked open like a gate after a hard winter. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know that she'd traveled 1,400 miles from Pennsylvania after burying her parents to influenza, didn't know she'd responded to his advertisement for a housekeeper sight unseen because she had nowhere else to go. All he knew in that moment was that the woman standing in the September sunshine looked lost and weary, and somehow exactly right, like a piece of his life he hadn't known was missing. Marianne brushed the dust from her sleeves and looked around the small town with eyes that held more doubt than hope. The mountains rose up behind Concord like sentinels, their peaks already touched with early snow even though it was only 1878 and autumn had barely begun. The town itself consisted of a single main street with buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and forgotten about just as quickly. She'd left behind cobblestone streets and gas lamps and neighbors she'd known since childhood, and now she stood in a place that felt like the very edge of the world. "Miss Walsh," a voice said, and she turned to find a man approaching her, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in spring. He held his hat in his hands, and there was something gentle in the way he looked at her, as though she were something precious that might startle and run. "Yes," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Northfield, Adam," he said. "Just Adam, if you don't mind. Let me take your bag." She hesitated before handing it over, and he noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly, the way she held herself like someone expecting disappointment. The advertisement he'd placed in the Eastern newspapers had been plain and practical, offering room and board plus $40 a month for a housekeeper on a cattle ranch 10 miles outside Concord. He'd received only 3 responses, and hers had been the most straightforward, written in neat script that told him she had education, asking only if the position was still available and when she should arrive. "The wagon's just there," he said, gesturing toward a sturdy buckboard hitched to 2 patient bay horses. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch. We can get you settled before supper." Marianne followed him, acutely aware of the curious stares from the townspeople who'd stopped their business to watch. A woman near the dress shop whispered something to her companion, and Marianne felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd known this would be difficult, traveling alone to work for a man she'd never met, but desperation left little room for propriety. Adam helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was calloused but careful, then climbed up beside her. He didn't sit too close, she noticed, leaving a respectful distance between them. As they rolled out of town, heading west toward the mountains, he began to speak in a low, easy voice that somehow made the vast emptiness around them feel less intimidating. "The ranch has been in my family for 8 years, he told her. "My father started it, brought cattle up from Texas. He passed 2 winters ago, and my mother followed him that same year. Heart just gave out, the doctor said, but I think she couldn't stand to be without him." He paused, his hands steady on the reins. "My brother went back east to study law, and my sister married a banker in Denver, so it's just been me and the hands for a while now." "How many hands?" Marianne asked, finding her voice. "3 regular. Tom's been with us since the beginning, solid as they come. Then there's Miguel, came up from New Mexico 5 years back, best hand with horses I've ever seen. And young Danny, he's only 19 but he works hard. They all have bunks in the outbuilding. The main house is just me." Just him, Marianne thought, and now her. She watched the landscape roll by, all golden grass and scattered pine, so different from the green hills of home. "What will my duties be exactly?" "Cooking, mostly," Adam said. "Washing up, keeping the house clean. I won't lie to you, it's gotten pretty rough. I'm not much good at anything domestic, and the hands are even worse. But I don't expect miracles. Just decent food and a clean place to sleep would be more than we've had." He glanced at her, and there was something in his expression that made Marianne's breath catch. Not hunger or impropriety, but simple loneliness, the kind she recognized because it matched her own. "I should tell you," he continued, "there'll be talk in town. A single woman living on a ranch with men. I can't stop people from thinking what they'll think, but I give you my word I'll treat you with respect. You'll have your own room with a lock on the door. The hands know better than to bother you, and if anyone in town gives you trouble, you tell me." Marianne studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried the weight of his responsibilities without complaint. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being honest." They rode in companionable silence for a while, and Marianne began to notice details she'd been too overwhelmed to see before. The way the afternoon light turned the grass to gold, the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The mountains ahead, no longer threatening but magnificent, their peaks touching a sky so blue it made her chest ache. "There," Adam said, pointing. "That's home." The ranch spread out in a valley between two ridges, a collection of buildings that looked small against the vastness of the land but sturdy and well-maintained. The main house was built of logs with a wide porch across the front, and smoke rose from the chimney. Beyond it stood a large barn, a stable, several outbuildings and corrals where cattle grazed peacefully. It wasn't grand, but there was something appealing about it, something that spoke of hard work and honest living. As they drew closer, 3 men emerged from the barn, clearly curious about the new arrival. Adam pulled the wagon up to the house and jumped down, then reached up to help Marianne descend. His hands were warm and strong around her waist, and he set her down gently. "Boys, this is Miss Walsh," Adam said, his tone making it clear he expected proper behavior. "She'll be keeping house for us. Miss Walsh, that's Tom, Miguel, and Danny." Tom was older, maybe 50, with a grizzled beard and kind eyes. Miguel was compact and dark-haired, with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. Danny was gangly and freckled, barely old enough to shave, and he looked at Marianne with open admiration until Tom elbowed him. "Pleased to meet you, miss," Tom said, touching his hat brim. "It'll be real nice having proper cooking again." Miguel nodded his agreement. "Welcome, Miss Walsh. Anything you need, you let us know." Danny just blushed and mumbled something incoherent that might have been a greeting. Adam picked up her bag again. "Let me show you the house." The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took Marianne's eyes a moment to adjust. When they did, she saw a large main room with a stone fireplace, a dining table that could seat 8, and mismatched furniture that had clearly been chosen for function over beauty. Doorways led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, and the dishes in the dry sink looked like they hadn't been properly washed in weeks. Adam had the grace to look embarrassed. "I know it's bad," he said. "I kept meaning to get to it, but there's always something that needs doing with the cattle or the buildings." "It's fine," Marianne said, and she meant it. This was work she understood, work that had clear outcomes. Clean or dirty, organized or chaotic, these were problems she could solve. "Show me my room." He led her down a short hallway to a door on the right. The room beyond was small but pleasant, with a real bed covered in a faded quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. It was cleaner than the main room, as though he'd made an effort here at least. "I hope it suits," Adam said, setting her bag on the bed. "There's extra blankets in the chest if you get cold. Colorado nights can be bitter, even in September. The privy is out back, and there's a bathing room off the kitchen, though you'll have to heat water for a proper bath." "It's more than I expected," Marianne said truthfully. In her worst imaginings during the long journey west, she'd pictured something far more primitive. "Thank you." Adam nodded, then seemed uncertain what to do next. "Well, I should let you get settled. We usually eat around sunset. No hurry tonight, though. We can make do with whatever." After he left, closing the door behind him, Marianne sat on the bed and let out a long breath. She'd done it. She'd traveled halfway across the country to a place where she knew no one, to work for a man she'd met less than 2 hours ago. It was either the bravest or the most foolish thing she'd ever done, and she wasn't sure which. But as she looked around the simple room, at the way the evening light slanted through the window, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not just relief at having arrived safely, but a tiny spark of possibility. Adam Northfield had kind eyes and gentle hands, and he'd looked at her not with judgment or suspicion, but with something that might have been hope. She stood and began to unpack her few belongings, hanging her other dress in the small wardrobe, placing her mother's Bible and her father's pocket watch on the dresser. Then she rolled up her sleeves and went to inspect the kitchen. The state of things was worse than she'd thought. The stove was caked with grease, the floor hadn't been swept in who knew how long, and the pantry held only the most basic supplies: flour, salt, coffee, a few cans of beans, some dried beef. She found a ham hanging in the cold cellar and onions and potatoes that were starting to sprout. Not much to work with, but she'd made meals from less. By the time the men came in for supper, she had the table cleared and scrubbed, a fire going in the stove, and a meal of fried ham, boiled potatoes, and gravy that used the last of some cream she'd found in the cool box. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and plentiful, and the way the men's faces lit up when they saw it made her feel useful for the first time in months. "Miss Walsh, this smells like heaven," Tom said, settling into a chair with obvious appreciation. They ate with focused intensity, barely speaking, and Marianne picked at her own plate, suddenly nervous. What if they didn't like her cooking? What if she'd made a terrible mistake coming here? But when Adam looked up and caught her eye, he smiled, and it transformed his whole face from serious to warm. "This is wonderful," he said. "Truly. I can't remember the last time I had gravy that wasn't full of lumps." The other men murmured agreement through mouthfuls of food, and Marianne felt her shoulders relax slightly. Maybe this would work out. Maybe she could make a place for herself here. After the meal, the hands excused themselves to their bunks, but Adam lingered, helping her clear the table despite her protests. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I'm the housekeeper." "I know, but it doesn't feel right, sitting while you work." He carried plates to the dry sink. "Besides, my mother would haunt me if I didn't help." They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, and Marianne found herself stealing glances at him. He moved with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was nothing arrogant about it. When he reached past her for a dishcloth, she caught the scent of soap and leather and something else, something earthy and male that made her pulse quicken. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly. "Of course. Why did you really come here? A woman with your education, you could have found work back east, teaching, maybe, or as a governess." Marianne kept her hands busy with the dishes. "My parents died within a week of each other this spring. Influenza." By the time the funeral expenses were paid and the debt settled, there was nothing left. The house had to be sold. I had no siblings, no other family. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I needed a fresh start, somewhere no one knew me as the Walsh girl, orphaned and pitiable. I'm sorry about your parents, Adam said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. And you, she asked, partly to change the subject. Why did you place the advertisement? Surely there are women in Concord who could have helped. Adam was quiet for a moment. There are a few, yes. But they all have their own families, their own responsibilities, and the ones who are single are mostly looking for husbands, not employment. He dried a plate with more focus than necessary. I'm not ready for that. Marriage, I mean. I was engaged once 3 years ago. Sarah, her name was. But when my parents died and she realized how much work the ranch really required, how isolated it is out here, she broke things off. Said she couldn't live this kind of life. I'm sorry, Marianne said softly. Don't be. She was honest about what she wanted, which is more than some people are. But it taught me something. I need help with the ranch, yes, but I need someone who understands it's a business arrangement. Someone who won't expect romance and poetry and trips to Denver for the theater. Something in Marianne's chest tightened at his words, though she couldn't have said why. A business arrangement, she repeated. Yes, that makes sense. But later, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Colorado night, she thought about the way Adam had looked at her in town, like she was exactly what he'd been hoping for. And she wondered if a business arrangement was really all he wanted, or if, like her, he was simply protecting a heart that had already been broken once. The days fell into a rhythm. Marianne rose before dawn to stoke the fire and start breakfast, feeding the men before they headed out to their work. Then she would spend the morning cleaning, methodically working her way through the neglected house. She washed windows, beat rugs, scrubbed floors until her hands were raw. In the afternoons, she'd prepare supper, bake bread, do laundry in the big copper tub behind the house. It was exhausting work, but there was satisfaction in it. In watching the house transform from bachelor squalor to something approaching a real home. In seeing the men's faces at mealtimes, grateful and content. In falling into bed each night so tired she didn't have time to dwell on everything she'd lost. Adam was respectful to a fault, keeping his distance, speaking to her politely but never presuming familiarity. Yet she'd catch him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression unguarded and wistful. And she'd find small kindnesses left for her. Wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, firewood already stacked by the stove, a new pair of work gloves that fit her hands perfectly. 2 weeks after her arrival, a cold front blew down from the mountains, bringing wind that rattled the windows and temperatures that made even the warmest coat insufficient. Marianne was taking laundry down from the line, fighting the wind for each sheet, when a particularly strong gust tore one free and sent it tumbling toward the creek. She ran after it without thinking, her skirts tangling around her legs. She'd almost caught it when her foot came down on a patch of mud and slid out from under her. She fell hard, landing in the shallow water with a splash and a cry of pain. Adam was there in seconds, appearing as if from nowhere, pulling her up out of the creek. "Are you hurt? Did you hit your head?" "No, I'm fine, just wet and foolish," Marianne said, but when she tried to stand, her ankle gave way and she gasped. Without hesitation, Adam swept her up into his arms, carrying her toward the house as easily as if she weighed nothing. "Miguel, Danny, get the door." The next few minutes were a blur of activity. Adam deposited her in a chair by the fire, and Tom appeared with blankets while Miguel ran for hot water. Danny stood uselessly in the corner, wringing his hands until Tom sent him to fetch the medical kit. "My ankle," Marianne managed through chattering teeth. "I think I twisted it." Adam knelt in front of her, his hands gentle as he examined her foot. She was acutely aware of how inappropriate this was, a man touching her ankle, but the pain and cold overrode any sense of propriety. His fingers probed carefully, and she winced when he touched a particularly tender spot. "Not broken," he said with relief. "Badly sprained, though. You'll need to stay off it for a few days." "I can't," Marianne protested. "There's too much work to do. Supper needs making, and the bread dough needs kneading, and we'll manage," Adam said firmly. "Tom can cook if he has to. It won't be good, but we won't starve. You need to rest." He wrapped her ankle carefully, then insisted on carrying her to her room, settling her on the bed with pillows propped under her foot. He brought her dry clothes and left her to change, then returned with tea and the stern instruction that she was not to get up unless absolutely necessary. For 3 days, Marianne was forced to accept help instead of giving it. Tom did indeed cook, producing meals that were edible if unimaginative. Miguel brought her books from the small shelf in the main room. Danny picked wildflowers and left them outside her door, too shy to hand them to her directly. And Adam checked on her constantly, bringing her tea, adjusting her pillows, sitting in the chair by her bed in the evenings to tell her about his day. She learned more about him in those 3 days than she had in the previous 2 weeks. How he'd wanted to be a veterinarian before his father's death called him home. How he loved the ranch despite its isolation, loved the sight of healthy cattle, the smell of rain on dry grass, the challenge of making something thrive in a hard land. How he sometimes felt like he was disappointing his father's memory by not being married, by not having children to pass the ranch to. "My father always said land without legacy is just dirt," Adam told her one evening, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "But I can't marry someone who doesn't love this life, and most women don't." "Some might," Marianne said, "if they were given a chance to see what you see." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted between them. Not just employer and employee anymore, but something else, something unnamed but potent. "What do you see?" he asked. Marianne thought about it. "I see space to breathe, room to become whoever I want to be instead of who people expect. I see honest work and beautiful sunsets. I see a man who cares about things, who builds instead of destroys." She paused. "I see home, I think, or at least the possibility of it." Adam's hand moved toward hers, then stopped, hanging in the air between them. "Marianne," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I should tell you something." "What?" "When you stepped off that stagecoach, covered in dust and looking like you weren't sure you'd made the right choice coming here, I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And every day since, that feeling has only gotten stronger. I know I said this was a business arrangement, and I meant it. I'm not going to pressure you or expect anything you're not willing to give. But I need you to know, in case it matters, that my feelings have become decidedly unbusinesslike." Marianne's heart hammered in her chest. "Adam, you don't have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I just wanted you to know, so there's no dishonesty between us." But Marianne reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "What if I told you my feelings have become unbusinesslike too?" The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, slow and warm and illuminating everything. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Then I'd say we should probably talk about renegotiating your contract. What did you have in mind?" Marianne asked, trying for lightness even as her pulse raced. "Well, the position of wife pays better than housekeeper," Adam said, his eyes dancing. "Full partnership in the ranch, lifetime security, and all the wildflowers you can stand. The work is similar, but the benefits are much improved." Marianne laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last laughed? "That's a terrible proposal." "I know," Adam admitted. "I'm out of practice. Can I try again? Please do." He grew serious then, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "Marianne Walsh, you came here expecting nothing and asking for little. But you've given me more than you know. You've made this house a home again. You've reminded me what it feels like to look forward to the end of the day, to want to hurry through my work so I can get back and see your face. I'm not offering you an easy life, and I'm not offering you society balls or fancy dresses. But I'm offering you my heart, completely and honestly, if you'll have it." Tears pricked Marianne's eyes. "I came here with nothing," she said softly. "No family, no future, just dust and doubt. But you looked at me like I was exactly what you'd been hoping for, like I was enough just as I was." "More than enough," Adam said fiercely. "You're everything." She squeezed his hand. "Then yes. Yes to renegotiating my contract. Yes to partnership and wildflowers and lifetime security. Yes to you." He leaned forward carefully, mindful of her injured ankle, and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, full of promise and possibility, and Marianne felt something inside her unclench, some tight knot of fear and loneliness finally releasing its grip. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Adam rested his forehead against hers. "We should do this properly. I'll take you into town once your ankle heals, get you a real ring, announce it properly." "I don't need a real ring," Marianne said. "I just need you." "You're getting both," Adam said firmly. "I want everyone to know you're spoken for, especially that clerk at the general store who keeps asking about you." Marianne blinked. "What clerk?" "The young one, Charles. He's asked Tom about you 3 times now. Whether you're really just the housekeeper, whether I'm courting you, whether you might be interested in callers." "I barely noticed him," Marianne said truthfully. "Good," Adam said with satisfaction. "But you're still getting a ring." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church in Concord, with Tom and Miguel and Danny standing as witnesses, and half the town in attendance because word had spread. And everyone wanted to see the Eastern girl who'd agreed to marry the lonely rancher. Marianne wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and Adam wore his best suit, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared made the church ladies fan themselves. The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Learning to share space, share a bed, share lives that had previously been separate and self-contained. There were moments of awkwardness, times when they stumbled over each other's habits and expectations. Adam had a tendency to track mud through the house, and Marianne discovered she snored when she was particularly tired, much to her mortification. But there was also wonder. The discovery of how perfectly her body fit against his when they lay together at night. The way he'd come find her during the day just to steal a kiss. The sound of his voice calling her name, full of affection and heat. The slow exploration of desire and pleasure, learning each other's bodies with patience and tenderness. Winter came hard that year, with snow that piled up past the windows and temperatures that kept them all close to the fire. It was a difficult season for ranching, requiring constant vigilance to keep the cattle alive and the buildings intact. But inside the house, it was cozy, almost magical. Marianne would cook hearty stews and fresh bread, and in the evenings, she and Adam would sit by the fire, her feet in his lap while he rubbed them, talking about everything and nothing. "Tell me about your parents," he said one night. So she did, painting pictures with words of her father who'd been a schoolteacher, patient and kind, and her mother who'd run their household with cheerful efficiency. How they'd loved each other in quiet, steadfast ways, with cups of tea delivered at just the right moment and hands held during evening walks. How their deaths had felt like the ground disappearing beneath her feet. "They would have liked you," she told Adam. "They would have appreciated how hard you work, how much integrity you have." "I wish I could have met them," Adam said. to thank them for raising such an extraordinary daughter. In turn, he told her about his own parents. His father, who'd dreamed of building something lasting, who'd driven cattle through impossible conditions to stake a claim in Colorado. His mother, who'd been tougher than she looked, who'd survived harsh winters and crop failures and the constant worry of frontier life. How they'd been a team facing every challenge together. "That's what I want for us," Adam said, "to be a team, to face whatever comes together." "We are," Marianne assured him. "We already are." Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Calving season meant sleepless nights and constant work, and Marianne found herself helping in ways she'd never imagined. Bottle feeding orphaned calves in the kitchen, staying up with Adam to check on laboring cows, even assisting with a difficult birth when Tom needed an extra pair of hands. She also discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching. She reorganized Adam's haphazard bookkeeping, created a system for tracking expenses and income, and noticed patterns in the accounts that helped them plan better for future purchases. "You're wasted as a housekeeper," Adam told her one evening, looking over the neat columns of figures she'd created. "You should have been a business manager." "I can be both," Marianne said. "That's the advantage of being the wife instead of the employee. I can make my own job description." By summer, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the hay crop was good, and they'd even purchased more land, expanding their holdings. Miguel taught Marianne to ride properly, and she discovered a love of being on horseback, of covering ground quickly and feeling the wind in her hair. She'd accompany Adam when he rode out to check fences or move cattle, and they'd sometimes pack a lunch and eat beside one of the mountain streams, talking and laughing like they had all the time in the world. It was during one of these rides in late August that Marianne realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but hadn't been sure until that morning when her breakfast had suddenly become unappealing, and she'd had to excuse herself. Now, sitting on a blanket beside Clear Creek with Adam's hand warm in hers, she knew it was time to tell him. "I have news," she said, her heart fluttering with nerves and excitement. Adam turned to her, his expression immediately concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think so. I've never done this before, so I'm not entirely sure, but I believe I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Adam just stared at her, his face blank with shock. Then a grin split his features, so wide and joyful it made her laugh. "Truly, a baby, truly." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt moisture on his cheeks when he finally pulled back. "I can't believe it. We're going to be parents." "You're happy?" Marianne asked, though it was obvious from his reaction. "Happy doesn't cover it," Adam said. "Marianne, you've given me everything. A home, a partnership, and now a child. I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I thank God every day that you stepped off that stagecoach." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Marianne found herself tired more easily and had to give up some of the heavier housework. Adam was protective to the point of being overbearing, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous, until she finally sat him down and explained that she was pregnant, not made of glass. "Women have been having babies while running households for thousands of years," she told him gently. "I promise I'll be careful, but I can't spend the next 7 months sitting in a chair." "I just want you safe," Adam said. "Both of you. We will be, but you have to trust me to know my own limits." He did try, though she'd still catch him hovering, ready to jump in if she so much as picked up a heavy pot. It was sweet, if occasionally irritating, and she loved him more for it. Winter came again, and Marianne grew round with child, and Adam built a cradle from pine wood he'd carefully sanded and oiled until it glowed. Tom whittled a set of wooden animals, and Miguel's wife, whom Marianne had become friends with during trips to town, knitted tiny blankets and caps. Danny announced he'd teach the baby to ride as soon as it was old enough, and everyone laughed at his enthusiasm. The baby came in late February during a snowstorm, and it was the hardest thing Marianne had ever done. The doctor from Concord couldn't make it through the drifts, so it was just her and Adam and Tom's wife Martha, who'd helped deliver half the babies in the county. For 12 hours, Marianne labored, and Adam held her hand and wiped her forehead and told her she was the strongest person he'd ever known. When their son finally entered the world, red-faced and squalling, Adam cried as he cut the cord, his hands shaking. "He's perfect," he kept saying. "He's absolutely perfect." They named him James after Adam's father and Thomas for Tom. Little James Northfield was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's eyes and his mother's dark hair. He transformed the household, bringing sleepless nights and endless laundry, but also laughter and wonder, and a sense of completeness Marianne hadn't known was possible. She'd watch Adam with their son, seeing the gentleness in his large hands as he held the tiny body, hearing the songs he'd make up while walking James around the room at midnight, and her heart would feel so full it might burst. This was family. This was home. This was everything she'd lost and found again, stronger and better than before. James was 6 months old when Adam came in from the fields one afternoon with unusual news. "The Johnson Ranch is for sale," he said. "Old man Johnson is moving to live with his daughter in California. It's 200 acres adjoining our northern border." "That's a lot of land," Marianne said, bouncing James on her hip. "It is, and it would give us room to expand significantly, maybe double our herd. But it would take most of our savings, and it's a risk. We'd be stretched thin for a few years." Marianne studied him. "What do you think we should do?" "I think we should talk about it as partners and decide together," Adam said. "This affects both of us, our whole family." They talked long into the night, weighing options and calculating figures. It was risky, but the potential payoff was substantial. And they were young, strong, willing to work hard. In the end, they decided to make an offer. The offer was accepted, and suddenly they owned 400 acres of prime grazing land. It meant more work, longer days, additional help to hire. But it also meant security, a future they could build on. They hired 2 more hands, young men eager to learn ranching. Tom took on more supervisory duties, and Miguel became the foreman, managing the day-to-day operations. Marianne expanded her role too, taking over more of the business operations, negotiating prices with buyers, managing contracts. She discovered she had a knack for it, and their profits increased. Some of the other ranchers grumbled about a woman being involved in business, but Adam just smiled and let their success speak for itself. James grew into a toddler, curious and fearless, tottering after his father on unsteady legs. Adam taught him to recognize different birds, to be gentle with animals, to respect the land that gave them their livelihood. Marianne taught him songs and stories, and on quiet afternoons, she'd hold him in her lap and read from books, watching his face light up with wonder. When James was 2, Marianne became pregnant again, and this time it was different from the start. She was sicker, more tired, and the baby carried differently. Martha took one look at her and declared she was having a girl. "I can always tell," Martha said with confidence. "You carry girls high in front, boys low and all around. This one's a girl, mark my words." Martha was right. Their daughter entered the world on a warm May morning, arriving so quickly there was barely time to prepare. She came into life the same way she'd live it, in a hurry and with determination. They named her Caroline, after Marianne's mother, and she had her father's red gold hair and her mother's strong will. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. The house was never quiet, never perfectly clean, always full of laughter and tears and the controlled chaos of family life. Adam would come in from working to find Marianne surrounded by children and paperwork, baby Caroline nursing while James helped his mother with the accounts by scribbling on spare paper, and he'd think he was the luckiest man alive. "You're staring again," Marianne would say, looking up with a smile. "Can you blame me? Look at what we've built." And she would look at the children and the home and the life they'd created. And she'd remember arriving in Concord covered in dust, carrying all her worldly possessions in a single bag, filled with doubt about whether she'd made the right choice. She'd remember Adam's face when he'd first seen her, the hope in his eyes, the careful respect in his voice. She'd remember learning to love him, slowly and then all at once, like falling into warmth after years of cold. The years passed in the way they do on a working ranch, marked not by seasons so much as by the cycle of birth and growth and harvest. James grew tall and serious, taking after his father in temperament and build. Caroline was bright and fierce, already showing signs of being able to manage her father and brother with nothing more than a look. 2 more children followed, another boy they named Daniel and a second daughter they called Grace, and the house rang with noise and life. Adam's hair started showing gray at the temples, and Marianne found laugh lines appearing around her eyes, but they wore their ages well, comfortable in their bodies and their lives. They still found time to be alone together, still made each other laugh, still looked at each other across a crowded dinner table with the private smiles of people who'd chosen each other and never regretted it. The ranch prospered. They became known throughout Colorado for quality cattle and fair dealing. Other ranchers came to Adam for advice, and Marianne's business acumen was acknowledged even by those who'd initially been skeptical. They weathered droughts and harsh winters, market downturns and unexpected expenses, but they weathered them together as the team they'd always been. Tom retired eventually, choosing to stay in a small cottage on the ranch property rather than move away. "This is home," he said simply. "I want to see those kids grow up." Miguel took over as full manager, and his oldest son joined the operation, keeping it a family business in spirit if not in name. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Adam took Marianne back to the spot beside Clear Creek, where she'd told him about their first pregnancy. They'd left the children with Martha for the afternoon, and it felt strange and wonderful to be alone together, like they were courting again. "Do you remember what you said the day we met?" Adam asked, pulling her close. "You said you came here with dust and doubt." "I remember," Marianne said. "I was terrified I'd made a mistake. And now—" She looked at him, at the face she knew as well as her own, at the eyes that still looked at her like she was exactly what he'd been hoping for. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made. Coming here, taking a chance on a lonely rancher with kind eyes and a dream of building something lasting. I saw hope when I saw you," Adam said softly, "and home. I didn't know why then, didn't understand it, but I knew you were meant to be here." "I was," Marianne agreed. "I am. This is where I belong." They kissed in the summer sunshine, surrounded by the land they'd built their life on, and it felt like a promise renewed. Not the promise they'd made 10 years ago in a church before witnesses, but something deeper and more personal. A promise to keep choosing each other, keep building together, keep creating home in all its messy, beautiful reality. Years continued their steady march. James went off to study agriculture at a college in Fort Collins, determined to bring new techniques back to the ranch. Caroline shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to be a doctor and set off for medical school in Denver, one of only a handful of women in her class. Daniel showed a talent for horses like Miguel, and Grace proved to have her mother's head for business. taking over more and more of the ranch's finances as she grew. Adam and Marianne watched their children become adults, and they were proud of each one, of the different paths they chose, the different ways they made their mark. The ranch had been meant to be a legacy, and it was, but not in the way Adam's father had envisioned. It was a legacy of hard work and honest dealing, of partnership and respect, of building something together that was greater than the sum of its parts. On a warm evening in late summer, 30 years after Marianne had first arrived in Concord, Adam and Marianne sat on the porch of the house they'd built together. They'd expanded it over the years, adding rooms as children came, then a wing for Tom in his old age, always growing and changing. Now it was full again, all 4 children home for a family gathering, plus spouses and grandchildren, the noise and chaos spilling out into the yard. "Did you ever imagine this?" Adam asked, his hand finding hers like it had 10,000 times before. "When you stepped off that stagecoach, did you imagine this?" Marianne thought about it, watching her grandson, James's boy, chase Caroline's daughter around the yard while Daniel tried to teach Grace's twins to rope a fence post. "No," she said honestly. "I couldn't have imagined it. I was too scared, too focused on just surviving, but I think part of me hoped for it, hoped that there was something better waiting even if I didn't know what shape it would take." "I knew," Adam said. "The moment I saw you, I knew my life was about to change. I just didn't know how much, how wonderfully." She squeezed his hand, these fingers she knew so well, weathered by work and time but still strong. "Tell me again," she said, a familiar request. And he did, the story he'd told her countless times over the decades, but that never got old. How he'd been standing outside the feed store, coiling rope, his mind on mundane things when the stagecoach had arrived. How a woman had stepped down into the dusty street, and his world had tilted on its axis. How she'd been covered in dust from the journey, and there'd been doubt in her eyes, uncertainty about the choice she'd made. But when she'd looked at him, when their eyes had met for the first time, he'd seen beyond the dust and doubt to the woman beneath. Strong and capable and looking for a place to belong. And he'd known, with a certainty that defied logic, that she was his home, his hope, his future. "And I was right," Adam said, lifting her hand to kiss it. "You were all of that and more." Their grandson ran up to the porch, breathless and laughing. "Grandma, tell us the story about how you came here on the stagecoach." Marianne smiled, pulling the boy onto her lap even though he was getting almost too big for it. The other grandchildren gathered around, always eager for stories, and she began the familiar tale. How she'd been alone and scared, how she'd traveled across the country to a place she'd never seen, how she'd arrived in Concord not knowing what awaited her. "Grandpa saw her and knew," James said, joining them on the porch. He'd heard this story his whole life. He knew right away she was special. "I was covered in dust," Marianne protested, as she always did. "The most beautiful dust I'd ever seen," Adam said, and everyone laughed. The evening settled into the comfortable rhythm of family, of food shared and stories told and children playing while the adults talked. Later, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet again, Adam and Marianne stood in their bedroom, the same room she'd first slept in all those years ago, though it had been expanded and improved countless times. "No regrets?" Adam asked, another familiar question. "Not a single one," Marianne said, equally familiar answer. "You? Only that I didn't meet you sooner," Adam said, "that we didn't have even more time together." "We have time still," Marianne said, "years and years ahead." "I hope so," Adam said. "But even if we only had today, it would be enough. You've given me a lifetime of happiness, Marianne, a lifetime of home." She kissed him then, and it was different from their first kiss but also the same, full of love and promise and the deep knowledge of being exactly where they belonged. Outside, the Colorado night was clear and star-filled, the mountains standing sentinel as they had for millennia, the land they'd worked and loved and built their life on spreading out in all directions. In the morning, there would be work to do as there always was. Cattle to check, fences to mend, accounts to balance, grandchildren to spoil. But right now, in this moment, there was just the two of them, the lonely rancher and the woman who'd arrived covered in dust and doubt, and the home they'd built together from hope and hard work, and a love that had lasted through every season. As they settled into bed, Adam pulled Marianne close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, that familiar and beloved sound. Tomorrow they'd celebrate their 30th anniversary with the whole family, a party that Grace had been planning for weeks. But tonight was just theirs, quiet and perfect and full of contentment. "I love you," Adam murmured into her hair. "From the moment I saw you until the moment I die and beyond that, into whatever comes after. You are my hope and my home and my everything." "And you are mine," Marianne whispered back. "You saw past the dust and doubt to who I really was, who I could become. You gave me a place to belong, a life worth living, a love worth having. I thank God every day that I was brave enough to take that stagecoach west." "I thank God you stepped off it in Concord," Adam said. "That of all the places you could have gone, all the advertisements you could have answered, you chose mine." "It chose us," Marianne said. "All of this, the ranch, the children, the life we've built. It felt like fate from the beginning, like pieces falling into place." They drifted toward sleep, still holding each other, and if anyone had looked in on them, they would have seen two people who'd grown old together with Grace, who'd weathered life's storms side by side, who'd built something lasting and true. They would have seen love in its most enduring form, not the passionate intensity of youth, but the deep contentment of two people who'd chosen each other every day for 30 years, and would choose each other for however many remained. The next morning brought sunshine and celebration. Grace had decorated the porch with bunting, and there was a feast laid out on tables in the yard. Neighbors and friends arrived throughout the morning, and the ranch filled with music and laughter. Adam and Marianne greeted each guest, accepting congratulations and well wishes, their hands intertwined as they'd been for 3 decades. James stood to give a speech, tall and confident like his father. "My parents taught me that love isn't just a feeling," he said. "It's a choice you make every day, a commitment you honor through good times and bad. They've shown us what partnership means, what it means to build a life together. And they've given us, their children, the greatest gift possible, the example of how to love well." Caroline spoke too, talking about her mother's strength, her willingness to take risks and forge her own path. "She came west when women weren't supposed to do such things," Caroline said. "She made her own way, built her own life, and in doing so, she showed me that I could too. That I could be a doctor, that I could do anything I set my mind to. And she taught me that being strong doesn't mean being alone, that the strongest thing you can do is love someone completely and let them love you back." Daniel and Grace added their own words, and by the time they finished, Marianne was crying, and Adam had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "Your mother and I," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "we didn't have the easiest start. We were strangers who took a chance on each other, who built something from nothing more than hope and hard work. There were times when it wasn't easy, when the ranch struggled, when money was tight, when we worried about making it through. But we always had each other, and that made everything bearable. She is the best decision I ever made, and I hope she feels the same about me." "I do," Marianne said loudly enough for everyone to hear, and laughter rippled through the crowd. The party continued through the afternoon and into the evening, and as the sun set over the mountains, Adam and Marianne danced in the yard to music played by Miguel's grandson on a fiddle. They danced together countless times over the years, but this felt special, weighted with the significance of 30 years of marriage, 30 years of partnership, 30 years of love. Worth it? Adam asked as they swayed together. Every moment, Marianne said. Every challenge, every hardship, every moment of doubt, all of it was worth it to get here to this. The years that followed were golden ones. They began to step back from the daily running of the ranch, letting James take over more and more of the operations while they advised from the sidelines. They traveled some, visiting Caroline in Denver, seeing parts of the country Marianne had only read about. But they always came home to Colorado, to the ranch, to the life they'd built. They grew older with grace, their hair turning white, their steps growing slower, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it deepened, became richer, like wine aged in oak barrels. They knew each other so completely that words were often unnecessary, a glance or a touch conveying volumes. On their 40th anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Adam took Marianne's hand and led her to the spot where they'd first kissed, where he'd first asked her to marry him. The creek still babbled past, and the mountains still stood sentinel, unchanging while everything else transformed around them. 40 years, Adam said wonderingly. How did we get so lucky? We chose each other, Marianne said simply. And we kept choosing each other every single day. I'd choose you again, Adam said. In every lifetime, in every circumstance, I'd choose you. And I'd choose you, Marianne said. My lonely rancher with kind eyes and a heart full of hope. They stood together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and they were young again, and old, and everything in between. They were the people they'd been when they first met, and the people they'd become through decades of loving each other. They were dust and doubt transformed into hope and home. Two separate lives woven together into something beautiful and unbreakable. As darkness fell and stars began to appear, they walked back to the house together. Their steps matched, their hands joined. Inside, their family waited, the legacy they'd built not just in land and cattle but in love and values, and the example of what two people could create when they chose each other completely. And if someone had asked Marianne in that moment whether she regretted answering that advertisement 40 years ago, whether she regretted stepping off that stagecoach into the dusty street of Concord, she would have laughed. Because that moment, that choice, had been the beginning of everything. It had been the first step toward home, toward love, toward a life so full and rich and meaningful that she sometimes had to stop and catch her breath at the beauty of it all. The lonely rancher had seen hope when he looked at her, dust-covered and doubt-filled. And he'd been right. She'd been his hope, just as he'd been hers. Together, they'd built a home that wasn't just a place but a feeling, a certainty, a love that would outlast them both and live on in the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward into the future.